Now, early on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about righteousness
Yes.
and being a good person.
Right.
And he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you can't live in the reality of the kingdom. And I can remember, I used to think, that used to be really scary to me, because I would think, well, the scribes and the Pharisees would fast twice a week and might memorize the whole Old Testament. And if you're telling me I got to do better than them, and they're already doing all those things, it sounds impossible. But based on what you're saying, when Jesus said your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, he's not setting the bar really high, he's setting the bar really low, because they don't actually have much.
He's actually changing the bar. It's a different bar. But it's very true. You see, they don't succeed. And he is not saying you've got to do more of what they do, but you have to move to a different category.
See, and that's where I think for most of us, when we think about spiritual growth or what counts as spiritual, we think about doing more of what they do. And
That's
whoever does
exactly
the
right.
most of those things is the most spiritual.
And that will usually be defined contextually by the particular group. Jesus' idea was, you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbors yourself. And that these are one thing, really one thing. The lawyer asked him for the great commandment. He gave them two, but they're not really separable. You can't love your neighbors yourself, which is one way of saying what I'm saying when I say that it's love, it's care for those who are around you. And you can't do that unless you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And of course, you can't really do that unless you know that God loves you. And not just that he loves you, but that also he is love.
I remember in one of your books you put it like this: spirituality wrongly understood or pursued is a major source of human misery and rebellion against God.
It is so true.
And
Yes.
that sentence, I'll bet I've said to myself 1,000 times, spirituality wrongly understood or pursued is a major source of human misery and rebellion against God. What would you say to people listening to this conversation who have the thought now, I think I have been living under a spirituality wrongly understood or pursued? How do they get on a different track?
Well, they want to answer that question. And a good place for them to begin would be to reflect on the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees as Jesus described it. And that was, I'm okay if I don't do what is wrong. There's some emphasis on doing what is right. But basically, the idea is, I think of my okayness, my goodness, in terms of not doing certain things. If they are thinking of it in those terms, then they need to shift from that level to questions like, what would I like to do if I could do anything and get away with it? And that gets you to the level, now you're beyond the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you are into the level of personality where actions come from.
What would I like to do if I thought I could get away with it? Because that will tell me what's inside.
It would tell you what's inside. That's exactly right. And actually, this is a very old device to help people see what righteousness is. You find it in Plato's Republic, where you have a fellow who discovered a magic ring, which he could just turn and make himself invisible. And the idea was that if he could do that, he would kill the king, marry the queen, the standard list of woe-be's on Jesus' list. But the
because
idea,
then I'd be well off. Those are things that I think would make me well off.
Absolutely, that's what makes you well off. And so let's go for them, and they would be just fine if God didn't have a thing about them. And but He does, and so we have to come to terms with that. And so back to miserable religion. But developing one's understanding of what is in one's heart. And then, by grace and effort, discipline, changing that. So that now the deeds that come out of that are the deeds of love.